Join me now as we enter the Word of God. From the beginning of the Pentateuch, the first 5 chapters of our Old Testament. From the book of Exodus, chapter 3, verses 1 through 15. Hear the word of the Lord. Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. And he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. And he looked, and lo, the bush was burning, and yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush is not burnt. When the Lord God saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here am I. Then he said, Do not come near. Put off your shoes from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. And then the Lord said, I have seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and I have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings. And I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them out of that land, a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, and the Hittites, and the Amorites, and the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And now, behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppressed them. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring forth my people, the sons of Israel, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the sons of Israel out of Egypt? And he said, But I will be with you, and this shall be a sign for you that I have sent to you. When you have brought forth the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God upon this mountain. Then Moses said to God, If I come to the people of Israel and say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, What is his name? What shall I say to them? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, Say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, Say this to the people of Israel, The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. This is the word of the Lord. Moses and the burning bush. One of the most well-known Old Testament stories that is appropriate enough to be in every children's Bible and fantastic enough to be listed as one of the most vivid and dramatic pictures of God's presence here on earth. The bush that would not be consumed by fire had attracted the attention of Moses, who was tending his father-in-law's flock in what is now the southernmost section of the Saudi Arabian peninsula. Most people know the life of Moses up until this point. He had been born into slavery in Egypt, first surviving the decree of the immediate killing of firstborn boys to the Israelite captive women. And then having been found in a floating basket and adopted by the Pharaoh's daughter, and then being suckled by his mother, posing as a nurse. Because Moses was still a Hebrew at heart, he killed an Egyptian who was beating a Hebrew kinsman and was forced to flee from Egypt for fear of his life. And he ended up in Midian among some distant blood relatives of his people in the mountains of Sinai. He had already married by this time, fathered a son, and was shepherding the family flock. In the meantime, back in Egypt, things had not gotten any easier for the Israelites. The Pharaoh had died, but there was another to rule over the Hebrews just as powerfully. So Moses' knowledge of and his affinity to God of the Hebrews had to this point only been through the connections of his Hebrew heritage in Egypt, and through his priestly family by his marriage. His God was the God of his ancestors, Abraham, to whom God had promised the lineage of the chosen people, of Isaac and Rebekah, and of Jacob, who saved his family from famine and established the 12 tribes of Israel. This was the Moses to whom God presented himself in the form of a spectacular display of fire in the desert that did not consume what it was burning. And when Moses stopped to check it out, God called his name. Moses said, "Here I am." And then God made his first request. "Come no closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the ground on which you are standing is holy ground. I am the God of your father Abraham, God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." So Moses took his shoes off. And here is where I stopped to ponder what that must have felt like for Moses, and why God made that the first item of his business in his encounter with Moses. While our Western culture does not have a practice of removing footwear in private home settings like Japan, or in places of worship in the Middle East, I experienced that when I entered a few Muslim places of worship. We took our shoes off immediately inside the door and put them in a little cubby to go participate in worship. We cannot wait. As our culture, we can't wait to doff the shoes in the spring to sandals or flip-flops. And most of us, some of us, may have even no shoes rules in our homes or in portions of our homes that we would like to keep a little cleaner. But why? For anyone in any culture, why is the removal of our shoes such a big deal? What happens to our feelings and our senses when our shoes come off? What's a memorable no shoes experience for you? At the beach? At home, in your family room? On a nature walk? But while you're thinking of that, let me tell you what came to my mind. I'm a Hope College alumni, soon to join the 50 club, the 50-year club. But at any rate, I had the opportunity to return to the campus around 15 years ago. I was at a Synod committee meeting. During some downtime from the meetings, I decided to walk the campus, and it started to rain pretty hard. I had an umbrella, but then impulsively I decided to carry the shoes that I was wearing. Through the rain, I walked every single watery sidewalk on that block of the campus, in the grass of the common areas, into the chapel where we worshiped and we sang concerts, passing the dorms where I very distinctly remember waving goodbye to my parents from the entrance step that first year. Being barefoot in the rain added an element of the released life layers, if you will. It was a sense of total spontaneity that lifted any sense of any propriety for me. It had opened up an openness to experience the campus in a totally different and reckless way. It provided a way to remember and appreciate the life that I lived there with the perspective of the years lived since. Could that have happened with my shoes on? Perhaps. But the experience was so much more vivid having experienced it through my feet being physically connected to the pathways that I took. The campus took on a sense of the sacred, for the gifts of growth that I had received during my years that I had spent there many lifetimes ago. So, when Moses shed his footwear at God's request, I can imagine that he felt the same sense of connectivity, but also one of vulnerability and uncomfortable openness that comes from removing some layers of protection. But in that place, with that lack of any barriers, he was able to meet God who was already there, waiting and calling. And I'll come back to that in a minute. When we remove our shoes, we allow ourselves to relax, to let down our anxiety, to leave the outside world behind, or even to be open to things that do not normally call our attention, whether it's nature itself, or our loved ones, or quiet times with the sacredness of things that are holy. We can listen harder. We can watch more closely. And we can feel more intensely, even through the pain that a stone can deliver. Letting our guard down can open the path to closer encounters with whatever is holy in the moment. And now I think it's important here to note that God was there. He was there at the source of the unconsuming fire, calling out to Moses and identifying himself to him. This wouldn't have been a very foreign concept to Moses, because the gods were not generally believed to dwell outside their sacred temples. But without a doubt, God was there. God did speak to Moses. God met Moses where he was, in the fields. And God will always meet us wherever we are. So as one proceeds further into the story, it becomes very evident that God knew Moses, and he knew of his people and their ongoing suffering at the hands of the Pharaoh. Not only is the God of Abraham and Jacob and Isaac ever present and all present, he is all-knowing. He also has a plan for his people and was now commissioning Moses to be his agent for change in the fulfillment of that plan. He presented himself to Moses in the midst of an aberration of reality and asked him to take off his sandals in order to open his receptivity to that holiness. And he then presented to Moses his plan to save the Hebrew people. God commissioned Moses to work through God's purpose, with a promise of being beside him in all of his endeavors. God's first command to Moses was to take off his shoes, because he was on holy ground. And we need to take a clue from that premier request of God to Moses. Take off our shoes in order to better find our own holy ground. When we take off our shoes, we are removing the pretenses. We are removing the protective barriers, and we are sometimes taking away the dirtiness of our lives. And also, sometimes we're taking away any insulation from the pain that life can give us. All of this is so that we can better seek the holy places that God is already preparing for us to meet him. He is already there. And it is at that point that we are much more open to receive him when he calls us by name. And then we can listen to the things that he knows are the next steps for us when we leave those holy places with our shoes on to do the work that he has planned for us. Moses met the God of our fathers and our mothers in the midst of his daily life, and that place was made holy ground by God's divine presence. As Moses approached, God summoned him, and Moses prepared for the encounter by removing his shoes and becoming vulnerable to God's will. May we all strive for better ears by removing our shoes.